The launch of the Mars 1 mission was the dawn of a new era. The date was circled on calendars across Earth, a momentous day that would be etched into history forever. As the massive rocket engines roared to life, sending the spacecraft into the vast unknown, Earth's collective breath seemed to hold for a fleeting moment. The mission was designed to do something no human had ever done before: establish a permanent colony on Mars. It was more than a scientific endeavor. It was a testament to humanity's unyielding desire to push boundaries, to reach beyond the stars and settle on a planet that was, in every way, an unforgiving frontier. However, the grandeur of the mission was accompanied by intense political and corporate competition. Nations scrambled to stake their claim in the space race, each vying for the prestige of leading the mission. Behind the scenes, corporations had invested billions, promising groundbreaking technologies and advancements. Governments saw Mars as a symbol of global power, a new frontier to assert dominance in the growing space age. As the rocket ascended, leaving Earth's atmosphere behind, it became clear that this mission was about more than just the crew. It was about Earth's ambitions, its future, and the dawning realization that humanity's path forward would no longer be confined to one planet. For the astronauts on board, the journey to Mars was both a privilege and a burden. Their names would be forever associated with the first interplanetary mission, their faces broadcast to millions on Earth. Yet, as they entered the cold void of space, their focus was entirely on the task ahead, to be the first settlers on Mars. In their hearts, they carried not just the weight of the mission, but the hopes of all humankind. As the days turned into months, the crew prepared for the most critical part of their journey, the descent. Mars, a cold, barren world far removed from Earth's warmth, awaited them. As they approached the red planet's atmosphere, the crew could see the vast stretch of barren land unfold below them. The landscape of Mars, with its rust-colored sands and jagged mountains, seemed to hold secrets older than time itself. For a brief moment, there was awe among the crew as they realized that they were about to step foot on a world that had never known the touch of human life. It was a new beginning for humanity, but it was also the beginning of an immense challenge. The ship touched down with a thud that echoed through the cabin. The landing had been smooth, but the weight of what came next hung heavy in the air. With the thrum of the engines dying down, the silence of Mars enveloped them. They were no longer on Earth, no longer part of the world they had known all their lives. They were pioneers, standing on the edge of the unknown, tasked with the monumental responsibility of turning a lifeless, inhospitable planet into a new home for humanity. The first steps were tentative, almost reverential. The door to the habitat opened, and one by one, the crew members stepped out onto the surface of Mars. The dust, kicked up by their boots, seemed to linger in the thin atmosphere, settling in a fine mist around their feet. As the cameras flashed and their steps were documented for all Earth to see, they were not just explorers, they were history in the making. The whole world watched as the first human footprints marked the red dust, symbolizing not only the quest for scientific discovery, but humanity's eternal hunger to reach beyond the stars. The crew stood there for a long moment, taking it all in. The Martian sky was a dull orange, tinged with the light of a distant sun, a stark contrast to the blue sky they had left behind on Earth. The horizon stretched endlessly before them, an alien world that would become their new reality. It was both beautiful and terrifying. They had trained for this moment, but the emotional weight of it was something no training could prepare them for. "Welcome to Mars," said Alexis, the mission commander, her voice steady but filled with emotion. The words felt heavy, like a promise to the future. As the crew moved to set up their first experiments, build the initial structures, and prepare for the long haul, the enormity of their task began to take shape. They were far from home, with no immediate way of returning. The habitat that had been carefully constructed was now their only shelter from the elements. Mars' atmosphere was thin and harsh, and its surface was unyielding. Every movement, every task had to be carefully calculated. They were not simply building a home, they were laying the foundation for the survival of an entirely new civilization. Days turned into weeks, and the reality of life on Mars began to set in. The crew had their routines, but it was far from easy. The habitat, though sturdy, was a constant reminder of the fragility of their existence. Their life support systems, while advanced, could fail at any moment. The food they had brought with them was rationed, and the water, extracted from the Martian soil, was scarce. Every day, they relied on each other more and more. They knew that their survival depended on their ability to adapt, to work together, and to make the most of the limited resources available to them. Despite the challenges, there were moments of triumph. Marco, the biologist, had successfully cultivated a small garden in the hydroponic systems, and Alexis had helped them build a makeshift power grid, tapping into Mars' meager energy resources. Slowly but surely, the beginnings of a colony began to take form. It wasn't much, just a few structures and a small patch of greenery, but it was the start of something unprecedented. Mars was no longer just a barren world. It was becoming home. Yet, even as the crew celebrated these small victories, the dangers of Mars were always present. The storms that could appear without warning, the constant threat of equipment failure, the harsh environment, all of it was a reminder of how fragile their existence was. But despite the obstacles, the crew carried on, knowing that each day brought them closer to their ultimate goal, the establishment of a permanent human presence on Mars. Over time, Mars began to feel less like an alien world and more like home. The crew's efforts at building a self-sustaining habitat were beginning to show results. They had developed systems to recycle water, grow food, and generate energy. Their dream of making Mars a new home for humanity was slowly becoming a reality. But this dream came at a great cost. The isolation, the constant pressure, and the overwhelming sense of responsibility weighed heavily on them. Each person struggled in their own way, but through it all, they found strength in each other. They had come to Mars as individuals, but they were becoming a team, a family, bound together by their shared mission. As the months passed, the crew of Mars One continued their efforts to tame the red planet. They knew the journey ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but they also knew that they were making history. Every step they took, every struggle they overcame, was a step toward building a future for humanity beyond Earth. Mars had become more than just a distant world. It had become a new frontier, a place where humanity could start over, build anew, and begin to dream again. In the end, Mars was not just a place. It was a symbol of human perseverance, of our drive to explore, to discover, and to survive. It was a symbol of our ability to face the unknown and turn it into something beautiful. The crew of Mars One had embarked on the greatest adventure humanity had ever known, and they were not going to stop until they had made Mars their new home. Crew had been on Mars for months now, and they had already faced countless challenges. From the initial chaos of landing to the unrelenting storms that tested their resolve, each day on the red planet felt like a test of endurance. But now, with the first Martian winter fast approaching, the true extent of the struggle was beginning to unfold. As the temperature began to drop, the team set out to strengthen the colony's life support systems. They had prepared for the cold, but nothing could truly simulate the harshness of the Martian winter. The habitat, while sturdy, wasn't immune to the brutal conditions. The insulation that had been enough to keep the colony warm during the relatively mild Martian spring and summer was no longer sufficient. The crew worked tirelessly, retrofitting the existing heating systems and adding new layers of protection to the habitat. But even with their best efforts, there was an underlying sense of anxiety. The heating system was already pushing its limits, and there was always the worry that one small malfunction could leave them vulnerable to the freezing cold that awaited them outside. It was a delicate balance. Too much pressure on the power grid could cause a failure, and too little heat could leave them vulnerable to the cold. Alexis paced through the corridors of the habitat, checking in with each member of her team as they worked. Maya, still working with Marco on the oxygen systems, muttered under her breath about the increased power consumption. Luca, who had been monitoring the water recycling systems, was having no better luck. The water supply, critical to the survival of the team, was becoming increasingly difficult to manage. They had already seen the initial signs of contamination from the dust storms, and the filtration system was showing signs of stress. If it were to fail, they would be left without clean water, an unforgivable failure on their part. But perhaps even more pressing than the water supply was the communications issue. Earth was growing farther away with every passing day, and the connection between the two planets had become increasingly unreliable. Messages that had once taken hours to send and receive now took days, and some simply never arrived at all. The crew had grown accustomed to waiting in silence, the eerie quiet of Mars pressing in on them, but the uncertainty of not hearing from Earth for weeks at a time was beginning to take its toll. Alexis could sense the growing anxiety in her team, a deep unease that came from the uncertainty of whether or not they would hear from Earth in time to solve any major issues. As the Martian winter settled in, the colony became a fortress, its walls growing colder and thicker with each passing day. Inside the habitat, life had taken on a monotonous rhythm. Every task, every movement was calculated, a result of the pressure to survive. But in the quiet hours between tasks, the isolation weighed heavily on the crew. The air in the colony seemed thicker, heavier, the tension palpable. Every minor malfunction felt like a potential disaster, every delayed communication from Earth an ominous sign. Then, one morning, it happened. The lights flickered. The usual hum of the systems powering the colony went silent, and the once steady buzz of life support seemed to fade into a haunting quiet. At first, it seemed like just another glitch, another power surge that could be fixed with a few adjustments. But when Maya and Marco ran diagnostics on the power grid, their faces turned pale. The problem wasn't a simple malfunction. It was a catastrophic failure. The primary power lines had shorted out, taking down the water filtration system and air purifiers along with it. In the freezing cold of Mars, without power to keep the colony running, the team was facing a nightmare scenario. Water was the first to go. Without the filtration systems, the water tanks rapidly began to deplete. The oxygen levels in the habitat were already dropping. The crew had little time to act before their lives were at risk. Desperation set in as Alexis gathered her team to brainstorm solutions. But as they began to assess the problem, an unsettling truth began to surface. This wasn't a random failure. The malfunction was too precise, too targeted. Every critical system had been hit, and the damage seemed intentional. "We're not just facing a power failure," Maya said quietly, her voice shaking. This was sabotage. The word hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Sabotage. The idea seemed impossible. How could one of their own have caused such damage? Who could want to undermine their mission? The crew members exchanged uneasy glances, their once united front now fractured by the implications of Maya's words. As they investigated further, the evidence began to mount. Small, seemingly insignificant changes had been made to the power grid's wiring. A minor switch had been flipped in the water filtration system, an error that seemed too intentional to be a coincidence. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became someone on the crew had deliberately sabotaged their systems. But who? And why? The suspicion began to gnaw at the team. Could it have been one of them? Or was there something more sinister at play? The possibility of espionage or sabotage by factions back on Earth couldn't be ignored. There were too many players in the race for Mars colonization, too many political and corporate interests at stake. And while the crew had been selected for their expertise and dedication to the mission, there was always the possibility of hidden agendas. For Alexis, this revelation brought more questions than answers. The thought that one of her own team members could be responsible for the disaster was almost too much to bear. The consequences of such betrayal would be catastrophic not just for the mission, but for their survival. The team's trust, already strained by the isolation of Mars, was now shattered. As the crew worked feverishly to restore power to the habitat, their minds began to spin. Who could be behind the sabotage? Was it someone trying to leave Mars early, or was there a deeper conspiracy at play? Could this be part of a larger plan to sabotage humanity's colonization of the Red Planet? And perhaps most terrifying of all, had they truly been alone on Mars? Or was there someone else out there, watching them, waiting for the perfect moment to strike? The pressure was mounting. Time was running out. Every minute that passed without a solution meant less air, less water, and less hope. The crew had to act fast, but the ever-present fear of sabotage clouded their judgment. They couldn't afford to make a mistake. Lives were on the line. As the chapter drew to a close, the team huddled in the darkened habitat, waiting for their systems to come back online. Their minds were heavy with suspicion, fear, and uncertainty. They had survived the first winter, but the true test of their mission, of their ability to trust one another and overcome the silent threat lurking in the shadows, was just beginning. The day started like any other in the colony. The sun barely peeked over the horizon, casting a soft red glow across the Martian landscape. Inside the habitat, the crew was already at work: routine checks, scientific research, and maintenance. However, an unexpected shift in the wind sent a shiver of unease through the team. The weather stations had predicted a mild dust storm, nothing more than a minor inconvenience. But within hours, the storm escalated into a massive, suffocating wall of red dust, blotting out everything in its path. The storm hit with terrifying force. Visibility dropped to zero, and the gusts howled around the habitat, shaking the thin metal walls of their temporary home. The crew scrambled to secure the external systems, knowing full well that even the smallest gap could prove disastrous. But as the storm raged on, they realized they were no longer in control. The habitat's external systems, which had held up well in previous tests, began to falter. The solar panels became covered in dust, rendering them nearly useless. The energy supply dwindled, and soon their communications with Earth were cut off. Inside the habitat, tensions mounted. With the storm outside, everyone was forced into the cramped quarters of their living spaces. The isolation was suffocating, not just physically, but emotionally. The bond between the crew members had always been the cornerstone of their survival. But now, with the storm cutting them off from each other, even the closest relationships began to fray. Alexis, the leader, did her best to remain calm, directing everyone to keep busy, but it was clear that the isolation was taking its toll on them all. In the days that followed, the crew faced challenges that were not just physical, but psychological. Without power, without communication, and with no end in sight to the storm, each person struggled to hold on to their sanity. Alexis knew that in times like these, their only hope was their resourcefulness and trust in one another. It was during this time that Maya, the engineer, came up with an idea. She suggested that they repurpose the habitat's air filtration systems to generate enough energy to recharge the backup batteries. The plan was risky. If the systems failed, it could render them completely powerless. But there was no other choice. The crew worked tirelessly, day and night, piecing together a solution from the limited materials they had. Marco, despite his growing fears, helped Maya as they fought to keep the habitat running. It was a test of endurance, of both body and spirit. With each passing hour, their energy levels drained, but they knew they had no choice but to keep going. If they didn't, the storm would be the least of their worries. After what felt like an eternity, the storm finally began to subside. The crew, battered and exhausted, emerged from the shelter of their habitat, blinking into the dim light of the Martian sky. The dust settled like a thick fog over the surface, but the worst was over. They had survived, and more importantly, they had learned something invaluable about themselves. They were not just explorers, they were survivors. As the storm cleared and the crew returned to their routine, the memory of those harrowing days lingered in their minds. But so too did the knowledge that they could rely on each other, that no matter the challenges Mars threw at them, they would endure together. It was several weeks after the storm when Marco first stumbled upon the object. He was out in the field, collecting soil samples for the ongoing study of Mars geology, when he noticed something unusual, a faint glimmer of something metallic, partially buried beneath the surface. At first, he thought it was just another odd rock formation, but as he dug deeper, it became clear that this was something much more significant. He quickly radioed the others, urging them to come to his location. When the crew arrived, they were stunned by what they found. A series of strange, angular artifacts lay buried beneath the Martian soil. They were unlike anything the crew had seen before, their sharp edges and intricate designs suggesting they were not naturally occurring. Alexis, Marco, and Maya began to carefully excavate the site, uncovering more and more objects as they went. The discovery sent shockwaves through the team. Could this be evidence of an ancient civilization that had once called Mars home? The implications of such a discovery were enormous. If Mars had once been home to intelligent life, it would change everything they thought they knew about the planet. And what happened to this civilization? Was it wiped out by a catastrophe, or had it evolved beyond the need for material existence, leaving behind only remnants of their culture? Crew worked tirelessly to uncover the full extent of the site, each artifact adding to the growing mystery. But as they dug deeper, strange things began to happen. They discovered a network of tunnels beneath the surface, each one more sophisticated than the last. There were signs of technology, though much of it was alien to them. Some of the objects seemed to be electronic, though powered by an energy source the crew could not identify. The deeper they went, the more they felt as though they were uncovering something they were never meant to find. It was Anna, the communications officer, who first noticed the strange symbols etched into the walls of one of the tunnels. They appeared to be some form of writing, though it was unlike anything found on Earth. As the team examined the markings, they realized that some of the symbols resembled patterns they had seen in the data sent back from Earth data that seemed to suggest that Mars had once supported life. Could this be proof of an ancient Martian civilization, one that had been lost to time? As the crew pored over the artifacts, they were forced to confront a question that loomed over them like a shadow. What if they weren't the first sentient beings to set foot on Mars? What if the planet's history was far older and more complex than they had ever imagined? Life on Mars had always been a challenge, but now, after the discovery of the ancient artifacts, it seemed that the stakes were higher than ever. The crew turned their attention to the new frontier terraforming Mars into a livable environment. Their initial successes had been modest, but the small greenhouse built near the habitat had begun to yield promising results. For the first time since their arrival, they saw green, actual plants growing in the Martian soil. It was a small victory, but it was enough to ignite a sense of hope among the crew. The greenhouse had been a key part of their plan to create a sustainable life on Mars. The plants they were growing, mainly vegetables, and a few fruits, were a sign that their terraforming efforts could be successful. The process was slow but steady. Water was being extracted from the soil, and the atmosphere, though thin, was beginning to show signs of change. As Earth watched eagerly, the crew's optimism began to grow. They had made progress, and they were determined to continue their work. The dream of a self-sustaining colony on Mars was no longer just a pipe dream. It was becoming a reality. But even as the settlers celebrated their first successful crops, a nagging feeling remained. Mars was a hostile world, one that could change without warning. The storms, the isolation, the dangers they faced, these were constant reminders of how fragile their existence was. And now, with the discovery of ancient Martian artifacts, the crew couldn't help but wonder, were they alone? Or were they standing on the precipice of an ancient mystery that would forever change the course of human history? Despite the uncertainty, the settlers pressed on. The crops were thriving, the terraforming efforts were making headway, and the promise of a future on Mars seemed more tangible than ever. But the question of what lay beneath the surface, both literally and figuratively, remained unanswered, hanging over the colony like an unspoken truth. And so, the crew of Mars One continued to toil, planting seeds in the soil, building their future and waiting for the next revelation, whatever it might be. The road ahead was uncertain, but they knew one thing for sure. They were pioneers, and no matter what Mars threw at them, they would face it together. The settlers of Mars had come a long way since the early days of their mission. Colony, once a unified group of people, bound together by a shared vision of humanity's future, was now showing signs of strain. Tensions had begun to simmer beneath the surface, as differing opinions on the future of Mars emerged. As Mars began to feel more like home, the settlers were faced with difficult questions about their autonomy and the role of Earth in their daily lives. Alexis stood at the observation window, her eyes tracing the red horizon where the barren landscape met the sky. It was a sight she had seen countless times, but today it felt different. The atmosphere in the habitat had changed. Where once there had been a sense of unity, now there was a subtle division growing between the settlers. Some, like Marco and Anna, had begun to argue for Mars' independence from Earth. They felt that the colony should not be subject to the whims of Earth's political powers and corporations. Mars was a new world, one that deserved its own identity, its own future. It was time for the settlers to forge their own path, free from the influence of Earth. But not everyone shared that vision. Luca and Maya, though supportive of the colony's growth, believed that Earth's influence was necessary for their survival. Earth's resources, expertise, and technology had made the settlement possible in the first place. The settlers were too small in number, too dependent on Earth's supply chains, to afford to sever ties. Their infrastructure, their safety, and their future relied on Earth, at least for now. And so a divide had formed. One faction sought independence, the other sought to maintain Earth's dominance. As the settlers debated, it was clear that their differences were becoming more than just ideological, they were personal. The atmosphere inside the habitat had shifted. Heated debates were becoming a daily occurrence. Words Once used to bond the settlers, words like team, unity, and survival were now being weaponized. Alexis tried to keep the peace, but as the days went by, the fractures deepened. Trust was eroding. The tensions were not just confined to the planning room anymore. They were spilling into everyday life, disrupting everything from scientific research to resource management. The colony was beginning to splinter, and it seemed that no one could see a way forward. In the midst of this political turmoil, a crisis struck. The water reserves that had been so carefully guarded and rationed had been contaminated. No one knew how it happened, but when Maya ran the tests, the results were unequivocal. A chemical compound, one that had never been seen before, had seeped into the water supply. The implications were immediate and dire. Water was the lifeblood of the colony. Without it, they could not survive. They had a limited supply, and this contamination was potentially catastrophic. Panic set in as the reality of the situation sank in. The contamination was not only dangerous, it was also an unknown threat. There was no telling how long it had been there, or what effects it would have on the settlers. Alexis immediately called for an emergency meeting. Everyone, from the biologists to the engineers, gathered in the control room. There was no time to waste. They had to find a solution fast. Maya and Marco were the first to begin working on a plan. They proposed a series of tests to identify the chemical compound, but the process was slow. With each passing hour, the colony's water supply dwindled and the pressure mounted. Tensions from the political divide seemed to have taken a backseat to the immediate survival of the colony. But even in this crisis, the cracks in the foundation were visible. As the pressure of the situation mounted, Alexis found herself wondering if the colony would survive long enough to settle its differences. She could feel the weight of her position, knowing that the future of Mars, at least for this group of settlers, rested on her shoulders. Days turned into a blur of testing, trial and error, and sleepless nights. Slowly, the team discovered the chemical compound was a byproduct of Mars' unique soil, something no one had anticipated. It was an organic compound that, when combined with the water filtration system, created a toxic reaction. Marco and Maya devised a way to neutralize the compound, but it would require a complete overhaul of the colony's water filtration system. This meant they would have to shut down the colony's primary water supply and risk running out of clean water before the new filtration system could be set up. As the situation worsened, Alexis had to make difficult decisions. The political divide seemed insignificant compared to the immediate crisis at hand, but the underlying tensions were never far from the surface. With limited resources and time, she was forced to make choices that only deepened the rift between the settlers. Some questioned her leadership. Others felt sidelined by decisions that seemed to favor the more moderate faction. No matter how she tried to unite them, it seemed like the fractures were too deep. When the water supply was finally purified and the crisis was averted, it felt like a victory, but it was bittersweet. The settlers had survived, but the cost was high. The political divide had only worsened, and the strain of the crisis had taken a toll on everyone. They had weathered the storm, but it had become clear that the colony was not just battling Mars, it was battling itself. The stress of the crisis seemed to have intensified when a massive solar flare erupted from the sun, sending a wave of electromagnetic radiation toward Mars. The flare was so powerful that it disrupted the colony's power grid, knocking out all communication with Earth. For the settlers, the flare was more than just a disruption. It was a reminder of their isolation. They had come to Mars with the hope of establishing a new beginning for humanity, but in this moment, they were reminded of their vulnerability. No matter how far they had come, they were still at the mercy of the universe. With the power grid down, the settlers were left in darkness. No lights, no heating, no communication. The flare had fried the colony's electronic systems, and it would take days to restore them. In the absence of power, the settlers were forced to confront not only the technical challenges of survival, but also the psychological toll of isolation. As the darkness enveloped them, old tensions resurfaced. With no way to communicate with Earth or the outside world, the settlers were left to face their own fears and uncertainties. Personal conflicts, once simmering beneath the surface, now erupted. The divide between those who sought autonomy for Mars and those who wanted to remain connected to Earth grew even more pronounced. Alexis could feel the cracks in the unity of the group widening. It was as if the flare had exposed the fault lines that had been hidden before. Luca and Maya clashed over the future of Mars. Marco and Anna, once close allies, now found themselves on opposite sides of the debate. Alexis tried to maintain control, but it was becoming increasingly clear that the settlers' survival was no longer just about the power grid or the oxygen supply. It was about the survival of their unity. As the days passed without communication from Earth, the weight of their isolation began to sink in. They were alone on Mars, with no outside support, no way to know what was happening on Earth, and no way of knowing how long they could hold on. The blackout had pushed the settlers to their limits. In their darkness, they had to face the reality of their situation. Survival on Mars was not just a matter of technology. It was a matter of unity. If they couldn't come together and work as a cohesive team, the colony wouldn't last. But the scars of their earlier conflicts ran deep, and in the cold, oppressive silence of the blackout, the settlers began to wonder if their divided loyalties would be their undoing. The blackout ended eventually, and the systems came back online. Power was restored, and communication with Earth was re-established. But the damage had been done. The settlers were not the same people they had been before the flare. The political divide had grown wider, and the emotional scars from the crisis were undeniable. For the first time, Alexis wondered if their dream of creating a sustainable, self-sufficient colony on Mars was possible. She didn't have answers, but she knew one thing for certain: the hardest challenges were still ahead. The settlers had been living on Mars for years, their community growing and evolving. What started as a solitary outpost had now become a bustling settlement. Families had begun to form. Children were born under the dim glow of the habitat's artificial lights, and the once isolated atmosphere now felt like home. But the settlers, despite their progress, could never escape the reality of the distance that separated them from Earth. Earth, the home they had left behind, remained a world full of problems and struggles that echoed faintly even on this distant planet. The settlers' daily lives were defined by their routines: farming, mining, construction, and the never-ending need to adapt and survive. Yet, despite the progress they had made in building a sustainable society on Mars, a creeping sense of alienation had begun to seep into their hearts. The cultural and political issues of Earth, once distant concerns, were now far too real in the lives of those who had left it behind. The power dynamics that had divided Earth, raging debates over resources, climate change, and political power began to make their presence felt among the settlers. In the early years, there had been a collective sense of unity. The survivors of the first wave of settlers had come together, knowing that their success depended on cooperation. But now, with time and generations passing, the cracks in that unity began to show. The settlers had not been immune to the politics of their old world. Disagreements over leadership, the allocation of resources, and what direction Mars should take as a new society were more intense than ever. Families clung to their earthborn ideologies, passing down the beliefs and ideals that had shaped their lives before they ever set foot on the red planet. Mars, as it turned out, was not a new beginning. It was an extension of Earth's complicated legacy. And no matter how far they tried to run from it, the settlers couldn't escape the complex web of history that followed them. It was not just the struggle for resources. It was the struggle for identity. And then came the second wave of settlers. The arrival of the second wave was a momentous event for the colony. New ships, loaded with supplies, technology, and hundreds of eager new colonists landed with great fanfare. At first, the settlers welcomed the newcomers with open arms, excited by the possibilities that these new people and technologies would bring. But it didn't take long for tensions to rise. The newcomers, many of whom were younger and full of ambition, had their own ideas of what the colony should look like. They were eager to push the colony in new directions, to innovate in ways the first settlers hadn't even thought possible. At first, the differences were small disagreements over how resources should be distributed, how technologies should be implemented, and the best way to build the next expansion. But as time passed, the divide grew. The first settlers, who had struggled through the initial hardships of life on Mars, felt a deep connection to the land they had tamed. They felt they had earned the right to lead, having forged a home in the harshest of conditions. The second generation, on the other hand, saw themselves as the ones with the vision to move Mars forward into a new age. They had access to newer technologies, advanced techniques, and ideas that the first settlers hadn't had. It was a battle between experience and innovation, between tradition and progress. And as the political climate on Mars began to heat up, the settlers realized that they were no longer united. They were two factions, two generations fighting for control of Mars' future. Amidst the growing tension, something else stirred beneath the surface, something the settlers had not anticipated. The discovery came unexpectedly. While exploring the deep caverns of Mars' northern hemisphere, a team of settlers stumbled upon a hidden underground structure. At first, it appeared to be just another natural formation, another strange feature of Mars' barren landscape. But as they dug deeper, they realized it was something far more remarkable. The structure was artificial, an ancient building that had been hidden beneath the surface of Mars for millennia. The settlers could hardly believe what they were seeing. The structure was vast, stretching far beneath the surface. Its architecture was unlike anything they had ever encountered, a mix of unfamiliar geometries and materials that seemed to defy conventional understanding. Some of the walls had strange symbols etched into them, symbols that appeared to be a form of writing in ancient language that no one on Mars could read. The implications of the discovery were staggering. Could this be the remnants of a civilization that once thrived on Mars? If so, where had they gone? And more importantly, what kind of technology did they leave behind? The discovery raised questions that could change the course of human history. As the team delved deeper into the structure, they found something even more shocking. A series of advanced technologies, many of which seemed far beyond anything the settlers had developed themselves. There were devices that emitted strange energy fields, equipment that appeared to harness the planet's energy in ways they had never imagined. The technology was alien in every sense of the word, but it was clear that whoever had built this structure had understood Mars in ways the settlers were only beginning to comprehend. The team was faced with a moral dilemma. Should they study these technologies, risking the possibility of unleashing something dangerous, or should they leave them untouched, knowing that the discovery might hold the key to Mars' future? The settlers debated furiously, with some believing the technology could provide a shortcut to the colony's survival, an edge that could help them thrive on Mars. Others, however, feared what might happen if they tampered with something they didn't understand. Could they trust these ancient Martians? Could they trust the technology they left behind? The tension between the two factions, the first and second wave settlers, only grew as the discovery of the ancient structure became more widely known. Some saw it as an opportunity to push for a new era of progress, while others feared the unknown consequences of disturbing something so alien. The discovery of the structure had thrown fuel on the fire of the colony's divisions, and now the settlers found themselves facing a new challenge, whether to unify and use the alien technology to their advantage or risk the future of Mars by attempting to keep the old ways intact. As the settlers prepared to delve deeper into the underground structure, one thing became clear. Mars was no longer just a barren world waiting to be colonized. It was a mystery, one that held both promise and danger. The settlers would have to confront not only the challenges of their divided colony, but also the mysteries of Mars itself. Could they unlock the secrets of the Red Planet? Or would they discover something far darker than they ever imagined? What lay hidden beneath Mars' surface was not just a testament to an ancient civilization, it was a challenge to humanity's future. And the settlers had to decide if they were ready to face the truth. The wind on Mars was as harsh as ever, but it didn't deter the settlers. Their work had always been about defying the impossible, and terraforming Mars was no exception. However, standing on the edge of the dome, looking out over the barren landscape, Alexis couldn't help but wonder if they were reaching too far, too fast. The conversation inside the control room had been fierce, with opinions divided down the middle. On one hand, the terraformers like Marco and Maya pushed for rapid, aggressive action, releasing large amounts of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere to trap heat and slowly transform the planet. The idea was to kickstart the process and turn Mars into a more hospitable environment, faster. But not everyone was so sure. There were others, Anna, Luca, and even Alexis herself, who questioned whether this approach was too risky. Mars was unpredictable, and even with the most advanced technology, they had no guarantees. They feared that accelerating the process could provoke unintended consequences, especially with the limited understanding they had of the planet's true nature. Could they trigger something they couldn't control, something they didn't yet understand? As Alexis listened to the arguments, she thought about the risks. The climate on Mars was inhospitable, the atmosphere too thin to support life. And while their goal had always been to make Mars livable, the more she thought about it, the more she wondered, was there a chance that they were playing with fire? Terraforming wasn't just about raising the temperature. It was about altering the very fabric of the planet's existence. And once they set it in motion, they couldn't stop it. The thought lingered as she stared out at the Martian horizon. The red planet was so still, so quiet, yet it felt like it was waiting for them to make their move. The settlers had their hopes, but Mars was far from cooperative. Each breath of wind across the land felt like the calm before a storm, an uncertain future they were about to shape, for better or worse. The debate wasn't going to be settled easily, but Alexis knew one thing for sure. The decision to terraform wasn't just about the colony, it was about the future of all humanity. And that was a weight no one could carry alone. The sky was unusually clear that day, an odd calmness settling over the colony. It was supposed to be a routine supply drop, another group of settlers, more equipment, maybe some advanced technology to aid in their terraforming efforts. But when the mysterious spacecraft landed in the designated landing zone, a ripple of confusion ran through the settlement. This wasn't any ordinary transport ship. The sleek, dark exterior the high-tech propulsion systems, and the symbol emblazoned on its hull. None of it matched anything they had seen before. Alexis, Maya, and Marco stood together, trying to make sense of it as the crew of the ship disembarked. They were not the familiar faces of Earth's space agencies or the corporations that had supported Mars One's mission. No, these were strangers wearing uniforms that didn't belong to any organization they recognized, carrying with them tech that far exceeded the tools the settlers had been working with. There was an unease in the air as the newcomers unloaded their equipment and began setting up. At first, they seemed helpful, offering assistance with tasks the settlers had struggled to complete. But something wasn't right. It wasn't just the advanced technology they carried, nor was it the fact that they were from Earth after all. Mars was still tied to Earth in many ways. It was the air of secrecy, the way they kept their communications tight, the lack of openness about their true mission. As days passed, suspicions grew. Anna, who had been the voice of reason on communications in the past, started receiving strange messages from Earth messages that didn't match up with the official updates the settlers had been getting. Was Earth pulling strings behind the scenes? Were these newcomers just a part of something bigger, something not everyone on Mars was aware of? The settlers tried to maintain a sense of unity, but trust was starting to fray. Alexis had always been a leader who put the team first, but now she found herself questioning whether she could truly trust the very people who had arrived to help them. Were they really here to aid in the survival of the colony, or were they sent with hidden motives? It wasn't just the newcomers that unsettled Alexis. It was the feeling that Earth was changing. The political landscape back home had shifted in ways they couldn't ignore. As the colonists grew more self-sufficient and less dependent on Earth's resources, the tension began to mount. What was Earth's true interest in Mars? And who, among the newcomers, could they really trust? The tension on Mars had always been palpable, but as the settlers pushed further into their terraforming project and the colony grew stronger, it became clear that Earth's political and corporate interests were beginning to shift. Mars was no longer just a scientific experiment. It was a valuable resource, a land of untapped potential that many back on Earth wanted to control. It started with subtle changes, new regulations on resources, new policies about ownership and technology. Earth's corporations began to take more aggressive steps, attempting to claim ownership of the vast mineral resources on Mars, to monopolize the new technologies that the settlers were developing. But it didn't stop there. Behind the corporate moves were governments, pushing their agendas, securing their power in ways the settlers hadn't anticipated. Tensions reached a boiling point when a powerful coalition of Earth's governments and corporations sent a fleet to Mars, demanding control of the colony's operations. Alexis and the other leaders of the settlement found themselves caught in the middle of a conflict they hadn't signed up for. Mars was supposed to be a place of hope, a new frontier for humanity. But now, it was a battleground, a pawn in a game of politics and corporate greed. At first, the settlers tried to negotiate, but the pressure from Earth was overwhelming. They had the superior resources, the superior technology, and the political power to back up their claims. The settlers were left with few options: submit to Earth's demands, or fight for their independence. But how could they fight back? Their weapons were tools of survival, not war. Their strength lay in their ingenuity and unity, not in military might. And yet, as the settlers of Mars looked out over the land they had fought so hard to tame, they realized they had no choice. The colony had become something greater than a mission. It had become a symbol of humanity's future, one that Earth's power players were unwilling to relinquish. It was a conflict no one had predicted, But as tensions escalated into skirmishes and threats, the settlers knew one thing: Mars would not be the same again. The dream of a peaceful, self-sustaining colony was slipping away, replaced by the reality of a new Martian war. The settlers had to decide what kind of future they wanted, one shaped by the forces of Earth, or one they could create on their own. As they prepared for the inevitable clash, the settlers realized that their survival depended not just on the harsh Martian environment, but on their ability to fight for the future of Mars itself. It was no longer just about surviving. It was about winning the freedom to shape their own destiny. And in the cold, unforgiving Martian soil, they would either find their strength or be buried beneath it. Red Dawn. As the sun's rays pierced through the thin Martian atmosphere, a new era had arrived. It was a dawn unlike any before. The first children born on Mars had grown, and now, for the first time, they stood at the threshold of adulthood. Their world was no longer just a series of habitats and barren red landscapes. To them, it was home, a place where they had lived, learned, and played, a world that was distinct from the Earth their parents had once known. Mira and Zane were among the first to step into adulthood. At 18, they had never known the Earth. The stories of it told by their parents were as distant as the stars. To them, the concept of home was no longer tethered to a blue planet spinning in the vast void. Mars had shaped them, and now they were shaped by Mars. The older settlers watched with mixed emotions. There was pride in seeing these young Martians take their first steps into adulthood, but there was also trepidation. The world they had built on Mars, so carefully constructed, was now being handed over to a new generation, one that had been born with the dust of Mars in their lungs, their eyes already adapted to the harsh red glow of the Martian sky. But for all the pride and anticipation, something was stirring beneath the surface. There were whispers, subtle at first, but growing in frequency. The young ones were starting to question things. Their loyalty to Earth, to the long-lost home of their ancestors, had always been assumed. But now, as they stood on the edge of adulthood, the question began to rise. What does it mean to be human? Mira, standing at the threshold of the Martian settlement, stared out over the red horizon. To her, the Martian dust was not a sign of desolation. It was a symbol of growth. It was a sign of transformation. The world her parents had fought so hard to tame was not the same world she would inherit. And so, she began to question the very fabric of her identity. The older settlers, especially those who had come from Earth's varied corners, still clung to the idea that Mars was a temporary home, a stepping stone for humanity's future, a backup to Earth's promise. But Mira could feel the ground shifting beneath her. Mars was no longer just a place where they survived. It was a place where they were becoming something new. Was it right for them to cling to Earth's ideals and history? Or had they already evolved beyond it? Her friend, Zane, felt much the same. Though the tension was unspoken, it was in the way they spoke about their future, where they might go, what they might do. The rest of their generation was already starting to wonder if they were truly Martian, or merely Earthlings trapped in an alien world. Their parents had been born on Earth, raised in its cities, surrounded by its green fields, and yet their legacy had been transferred here. But for Mira and Zane, Mars was home, and Earth was a distant memory. It wasn't just a philosophical question. It was practical. They had grown up in the habitat modules, seen the expansion of their own settlements, watched as Mars transformed from a barren landscape to something that resembled civilization. Their world was not so different from the stories of Earth. They had food, water, a community, a future. But those who still clung to Earth's influence wanted them to believe that their place was secondary, that Earth would always be their guiding force. The parents, Those who had endured the early years of hardship began to question whether the next generation understood what Earth represented. To them, Earth was the origin of humanity, the cradle of civilization. But to the children born on Mars, Earth was a distant echo. And slowly, the concept of loyalty to a world they had never seen started to erode. For Mira and Zane, the question of loyalty was intertwined with their own sense of identity. They had been born on Mars, raised by people who had faced the impossible to survive. They had watched as their parents struggled to terraform the soil, build a sustainable atmosphere, and create something worth preserving. They respected that more than anyone could understand. But did that mean they should accept Earth's claim over them? Could they stand by and let Earth dictate their future, their place in the galaxy? Or did they owe their allegiance to the planet that had shaped them into the people they had become? The debate brewed in silence. They knew that if they spoke out, if they voiced their doubts, the older generation would see them as ungrateful, as rebels. But Mira and Zane weren't rebels. They were Martians. And one day, they would have to decide what that truly meant. Beyond Earth, the air was thick with tension. The settlers of Mars stood at the precipice of a decision that would change the course of humanity's future. The question that had simmered in the background for so long had finally come to a head. Should Mars remain loyal to Earth, or should it declare its independence and chart its own future? For years, Earth had guided their mission, sending supplies, offering advice, and maintaining a tenuous control over Mars' growth. But Mars had evolved. The settlers had faced the unthinkable. They had conquered Mars' hostile terrain, built their homes from nothing, and established a society that functioned without the direct aid of Earth. And now they were beginning to ask, could they stand on their own? The debate that raged across Mars was not a simple one. On one side were the pioneers, the original settlers who had come from Earth with the dream of building a new future. They had fought and bled for this world. They still remembered the struggles of those early days of living in the cramped habitats, battling radiation, and surviving on meager supplies. Their loyalty to Earth was unwavering. Earth had given them life, given them the tools they needed to survive. Earth was their guiding star. But there was another faction, led by the young Martians, like Mira and Zane. They had grown up with a different perspective. They had never seen the beauty of Earth, never felt the warmth of its sun on their skin. To them, Earth was a distant, almost mythical place, a place their parents had spoken about, but one they had never experienced. And as Mars flourished, they began to wonder, why should they be tethered to Earth? Why shouldn't Mars be free to determine its own path, its own identity? The first real crack in the unity of Mars came when a small group of young Martians, led by Mira and Zane, openly questioned Earth's authority. They called for a vote, a decision that would mark the beginning of a new chapter for Mars. Would they remain loyal to Earth and continue their role as an extension of humanity's legacy? Or would they declare independence and forge a future of their own? The tension was palpable. Both sides had valid points. Earth had given them the resources, the knowledge, and the courage to reach for the stars. But Mars was not Earth. It was a world of its own, a place where new ideas, new ways of thinking, and new ways of living had blossomed. Could they still hold on to the notion that Earth had the right to decide their fate? The vote, when it finally came, was a moment of reckoning. It wasn't just a vote on whether to sever ties with Earth. It was a vote on what it meant to be human, what it meant to be Martian. The older settlers cast their ballots with heavy hearts, understanding that a break from Earth could mean facing the unknown. But the young Martians, eager for a future free from Earth's shadow, voted in overwhelming numbers to declare independence. The decision was made. Mars had declared its independence. The settlers stood at the dawn of a new era, one that would take them beyond Earth and into the great unknown. The world of Mars, now free from Earth's influence, was a blank slate. The settlers knew they had much to do. The path ahead would not be easy. They would face new challenges, diplomatic, logistical, and existential. They would need to build alliances, forge new treaties, and ensure that their independence was recognized by the rest of humanity. But for the first time, they were no longer a colony. They were their own people, with their own future to define. As the dust settled, Mira and Zane stood side by side, gazing out over the Martian landscape. The world before them was vast, but it was no longer just a world of survival. It was a world of possibilities of self-determination and hope. The future of Mars, and perhaps the future of humanity itself, now lay in their hands.